what happens when you take a kid with an IQ of 167 and you just sort of isolate him in a remote cabin without electricity and basically feed him nothing but his own growing rage and like radical sociological theory for 2 decades?
Yeah, it's a terrifying recipe, honestly.
Right. And I mean, if you are listening to this on a smartphone or a laptop right now, the man we are discussing today would argue that the device in your hand is actually controlling you, which is, what's deeply unsettling is that today, plenty of people might actually partially agree with that underlying anxiety about modern life.
Oh, absolutely. That fear is incredibly common now.
Exactly. And that is exactly why we need to dissect how one incredibly brilliant mind weaponized that very common fear. So today, we're taking a deep dive into the longest, most expensive investigation in FBI history, and we're piecing together the life of Theodore Kaczynski, who is, of course, universally known as the Unabomber.
And, the contrast is really what makes this history so hard to process. I mean, we are looking at a chronological timeline of a young man who was, by all accounts, entirely poised to become one of the most brilliant mathematical minds of his generation.
Right, a total prodigy.
Yeah, exactly.
Huh.
And we have to map out the very specific sequence of decisions, the psychological shifts, and this extreme isolation that transformed that teenage prodigy into a domestic terrorist responsible for, a 17-year campaign of violence.
Because we often think of history's notorious figures as these, monsters just naturally emerging, fully formed from the shadows. But today, we're tracking what is basically a slow-motion derailment. We're looking at the mechanisms of a mind just methodically disconnecting from humanity.
Methodically is the perfect word for it.
Right, and to understand that derailment, you really have to look at how the tracks were initially laid down. So Kaczynski was born in Chicago in 1942 into a working-class family. And early records describe a pretty healthy, well-adjusted kid.
Yeah, totally normal early on.
But the structural integrity of his childhood seems to just crack the moment his school administers an IQ test. He scores a 167, and the administration's brilliant solution is to just skip him entirely past the 6th grade.
Which, that administrative decision completely severed his social development. Before that jump, Kaczynski was reportedly like a leader among his peers. He had standing, he had friends his own age.
Yeah.
But plunging a child into a classroom with much older, larger adolescents meant he just no longer fit in physically or emotionally.
So he's just a kid surrounded by teenagers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he became a target for really intense bullying. The adults in his life basically prioritized his intellectual acceleration at the absolute expense of his ability to just relate to other human beings.
I mean, that feels like pushing someone into the deep end of the ocean just because they're good at reading books about swimming.
That's a great way to put it.
Like they threw him in before he even knew how to tread water socially. Do we see this kind of extreme, unbalanced acceleration frequently backfiring in prodigies?
Oh, yeah. When the support system only nurtures the intellect and completely ignores the human being attached to it, the results can be incredibly damaging. High school classmates and neighbors later admitted they didn't even view him as a fully formed personality.
Wow, really?
Yeah, one classmate memorably described him as just a walking brain. Because he lacked the tools to navigate the social hierarchy, his primary coping mechanism became retreating into a world where he had absolute control.
Which is math.
Right, the realm of advanced mathematics.
Which, of course, only accelerates the timeline even more. I mean, he graduates high school at 15. By 16 years old, he is entering Harvard University on a scholarship.
Just 16.
Think about that for a second. They packed up an emotionally stunted teenager and just dropped him into a grueling, highly competitive Ivy League environment before he even had a driver's license.
And Harvard in the late 1950s was a very rigid, demanding place. But the truly pivotal mechanism of his time there, the thing that really shaped him, occurred during his sophomore year when he volunteered for a psychological study.
Right. This is the Henry Murray study.
Exactly. Led by a prominent Harvard psychologist named Henry Murray. The students were told they were participating in a study on personal philosophy. They were instructed to write these deeply intimate essays detailing their core beliefs, their private aspirations, their ideals.
But they were essentially just handing over the blueprints to their own psychological vulnerabilities, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The study was essentially a highly structured, verbally abusive interrogation.
Good.
Murray took those intimate essays and handed them to an anonymous individual, often like a law student, whose specific job was to ruthlessly, systematically attack the subject's core beliefs.
So they were basically weaponizing these kids' own thoughts against them.
Yes, they strapped Kaczynski to a chair,
Bro.
attached electrodes to measure his physiological reactions, heart rate, sweat shone bright lights in his eyes, and used his own written thoughts as ammunition to just belittle and humiliate him.
I mean, I am just trying to put myself in the shoes of a 16-year-old kid who already feels completely alien to the human race. You finally open up, you write down what you actually believe, and an authority figure at the most prestigious institution in the country just uses it to systematically tear you apart.
And he didn't just go through this once. He endured over 200 hours of this over 3 years.
Over 3 years. It is incredibly easy to see how a profound, permanent distrust of institutions and authority begins to, calcify right there in that room.
Well, Kaczynski's defense attorneys later pointed to this exact study as the genesis of his deep-seated hostility towards psychological manipulation and systemic control. It practically trained him to view society not as a community, but as a hostile machine designed to just break down the individual.
Yet, outwardly, the academic momentum just keeps carrying him forward, right? After Harvard, he goes to the University of Michigan for his master's and PhD. And he's operating on a frequency that leaves his own professors completely baffled.
Yeah, he was tackling problems in something called complex analysis and geometric function theory.
Okay, wait, before we go further, can we break down what that actually means? Because I feel like it's relevant to how his brain worked.
Sure, yeah. So geometric function theory is essentially the study of how complex shapes and spaces map onto each other in, abstract dimensions.
Okay.
It requires an individual to hold entirely theoretical, invisible structures in their head and manipulate them using pure logic. It is a realm of absolute perfection, totally divorced from the messy reality of human emotion.
So it's completely abstract.
Exactly. And his 1967 dissertation solved a problem that his unprofessors had completely given up on. A committee member later estimated that maybe 10 or 12 people in the entire United States could even comprehend the math Kaczynski was doing.
That is wild. He is spending his days entirely in a realm of pure, cold logic, and that abstraction wins him the university's top prize and lands him a job as an acting assistant professor at UC Berkeley. At 25, he is the youngest assistant professor in the history of the university. But Berkeley is where the facade completely shatters. By 1969, at age 27, he abruptly resigns.
Yeah, but he just walks away.
He leaves this highly coveted academic position with zero explanation.
And the resignation absolutely baffled his colleagues. But the historical record reveals a profound internal crisis that occurred shortly before this, during his time at Michigan in 1966. And this crisis, this is important, had absolutely nothing to do with mathematics or anti-technology politics.
Right.
Kaczynski experienced a period of intense gender dysphoria. He developed persistent fantasies of being female, which became so overwhelming that he actually made the decision to undergo a gender transition.
Wow.
Yeah, he scheduled an appointment with a campus psychiatrist to begin the medical process.
See, I'm struggling to connect the dots here. We are jumping from abstract math to a gender identity crisis. I mean, how does a deeply personal internal struggle like that mutate into anti-tech terrorism?
Well, the mutation happened in the waiting room.
Real.
Yeah, Kaczynski later wrote about this exact moment in his journals. He arrived for his psychiatric appointment, but as he sat there in the waiting room, the social anxiety and a crushing sense of shame just completely overwhelmed him.
Oh, wow.
He went into the doctor's office, but he entirely pivoted. He claimed he was there to discuss anxiety about his academic future, never once mentioning his gender dysphoria.
So he just completely retreated back into himself.
He did, and the psychological whiplash of that was devastating. He walked out of that clinic filled with intense self-disgust. But rather than internalizing that shame, his mind instantly externalized it into a blinding homicidal rage directed at the psychiatrist, and by extension, the entire societal system that made him feel so profoundly broken.
That is quite the leap.
It is. But he explicitly documented that from the ashes of that intense despair, he found what he called a glorious new hope.
The glorious new hope.
Yeah, and that hope was a newly formed commitment to violently retaliate against a world he felt fundamentally rejected by.
That completely reframes his timeline. The original spark for his violent ideation wasn't like a philosophical grievance about computers or industry at all. It was rooted in profound personal trauma, a crisis of identity, and an inability to speak his own truth.
Exactly.
So when he resigns from Berkeley a few years later, he is already psychologically severing his ties to humanity. By 1971, he relocates to a tiny, self-built cabin in Lincoln, Montana. No electricity, no running water.
Right, and in the beginning, the objective in Montana seemed to be pure survival and self-sufficiency. He taught himself to hunt, forage, grow his own food. He just wanted absolute autonomy.
He wanted off the grid.
Totally off the grid.
Yeah.
But during this extreme physical isolation, his intellectual diet shifted drastically.
Mhm.
He began obsessively consuming sociology and political philosophy. And he was particularly captivated by a book called The Technological Society by French philosopher Jacques Ellul.
Okay, I've heard of this.
Yeah, this text essentially provided the academic scaffolding for the directionless rage he had harbored since Michigan.
He finally found a framework that validated his hatred, basically. Because Ellul's work argued that technology isn't just a collection of neutral tools, but rather an all-encompassing system that inevitably crushes human freedom and dictates how we live.
Precisely. But, reading philosophy in a cabin doesn't make someone a domestic terrorist. The shift from wanting to escape the system to actively wanting to destroy it,
Yeah.
that required a catalyst.
Right.
And that moment arrived in the summer of 1983. Kaczynski had a favorite untouched plateau in the wilderness. It featured a beautiful waterfall. It was a 2-day hike from his cabin, and it served as his ultimate sanctuary.
It was his safe space.
Yeah. But he made the trek out there one day to find peace, only to discover that a new loggy road had been paved right through the middle of his sacred spot.
The ultimate intrusion. I mean, it is as if he viewed industrial society as a massive, unstoppable bulldozer. And when he realized that simply running away wasn't going to work, that the bulldozer would eventually pave over his last remaining refuge, he decided he had to start building bombs to just throw wrenches into the gears.
He documented that exact realization, actually. He stated that the moment he saw the road, he decided he was done trying to learn wilderness survival skills.
Yeah.
Retaliation became his only perceived option. If the system was going to destroy his world, he was going to destroy the system.
And that realization kicks off a 17-year campaign of terror. From 1978 to 1995, he mails or hand-delivers 16 increasingly sophisticated explosive devices. 3 people are killed and 23 are severely injured.
Yeah.
And these victims, they were academics, executives, computer store owners, basically people merely doing their jobs. And here's where I want to dig into the how, because these weren't crude, easily traceable pipe bombs, were they?
No, not at all. The craftsmanship was terrifyingly meticulous, and it was entirely designed to thwart forensic investigation. He understood that mass-produced components leave a paper trail.
Wow.
So he actually cast his own metal parts by melting down scrap aluminum in his wood-burning stove. He peeled the outer layers off batteries to remove manufacturing codes. He built his own switches. And the FBI noted a bizarre, overarching obsession with wood throughout the campaign.
Right, yeah. He frequently used scrap wood to construct the bomb casings instead of metal pipes, right?
Yep.
He would tuck bits of tree bark or twigs inside of devices. He even selected targets with wood-related names, like Percy Wood, who is the president of United Airlines, or targets associated with places like Arbor House Publishing.
It was incredibly calculated. And beyond the material construction, he actively planted false clues to misdirect the investigators.
Like what?
Well, he placed metal plates inside the bombs stamped with the initials FC, which he later revealed stood for Freedom Club. He used distinctive Eugene O'Neill postage stamps to send the FBI profiling team chasing literary clues that meant absolutely nothing.
Wow.
He would even purposefully ensure that the fingerprints found on his letters did not match the fingerprints carefully left on the bomb components.
So he is entirely dictating the terms of the investigation. The FBI forms this massive Unabomber task force standing for university and airline bombing. They have over 150 agents. How on earth did this incredibly well-funded task force spend over a decade looking in the completely wrong direction?
It is a classic case of becoming blinded by physical evidence. Early on in the investigation, a pioneering FBI profiler named John Douglas actually produced a remarkably accurate hypothesis.
Really?
Yeah. Douglas suggested the bomber was a highly intelligent, reclusive man with deep connections to academia. But the task force leadership eventually discarded that psychological profile entirely.
Why would they throw that out?
Because they got hyper-focused on the physical scraps. They looked at the rudimentary wood casings, the hand-cast metal, the lack of sophisticated electronic timers, and they pivoted to a rival theory. They decided they were looking for a blue-collar airline mechanic with a grudge.
I mean, that is an incredible failure of imagination. It's like trying to catch a highly sophisticated bank robber by only tracking people who buy cheap ski masks and just completely ignoring the fact that you might be looking for a brilliant bank manager who knows how the vault operates.
Exactly.
They were so fixated on the crude physical scraps that they completely missed the genius-level intellect required to engineer an untraceable device.
And that fundamental pivot allowed Kaczynski to operate with impunity for years. They were hunting a phantom mechanic, while the former Berkeley mathematics professor was quietly building his next device in the woods.
Unbelievable.
The stalemate didn't actually break until 1995, and it only broke because Kaczynski forced the issue. He issued a public ultimatum. He promised to permanently halt his bombing campaign if a major national newspaper published his 35,000-word treatise, a document the FBI dubbed the Unabomber manifesto, officially titled Industrial Society and Its Future.
And before we delve into what this document actually contained, we really need to establish a very clear boundary for you, the listener. Our purpose here is strictly to report the stated motives from the historical record so we can understand the mechanics of his ideology. We are absolutely not endorsing, validating, or agreeing with any of his political, social, or philosophical critiques.
That is a crucial distinction. The foundational argument Kaczynski laid out was that the Industrial Revolution had been a disaster for the human race. He posited that modern technology requires humans to live and work under conditions that are radically opposed to our evolutionary nature.
Okay.
Because the system deprives us of the need to struggle for basic survival, he argued that society forces people into what he called surrogate activities.
And by surrogate activities, he meant things like chasing corporate promotions, obsessing over professional sports, or consuming mass entertainment, right?
Yes, exactly.
He viewed these as artificial pursuits designed to keep people distracted and docile while the technological system quietly crushed their autonomy.
Exactly. He predicted a grim future driven by artificial intelligence, where humanity would eventually be genetically engineered or psychologically coerced to serve the needs of the technological system rather than technology serving human needs.
Which is a fear that definitely resonates today.
It does. But he explicitly stated that political reform was useless, and the only viable solution was a complete, chaotic collapse of industrial society.
And he had a profound hatred for both ends of the political spectrum, didn't he?
Oh, he did. A significant portion of the manifesto is dedicated to vehemently attacking political movements. He despised the political left, claiming leftist movements were driven by something he called over-socialization.
Over-socialization.
Yeah, he believed they were so conditioned to follow societal rules that they violently tried to force everyone else into conformity, making them the ultimate defenders of systemic control. But he equally attacked the political right, calling conservatives fools for constantly complaining about the decay of traditional values, while simultaneously championing the relentless technological progress and economic growth that actually destroyed those values.
So the FBI and the U.S. Attorney General, Janet Reno, were basically faced with an impossible choice: give a terrorist exactly what he wants or risk more lives. They ultimately pushed for the Washington Post and the New York Times to publish it in September 1995.
It was a massive gamble.
Yeah, but it actually worked, just not in the way Kaczynski intended.
Right. He believed the public would read his words and instantly rise up in a grand anti-tech revolution. Instead, the publication exposed him. Kaczynski's younger brother, David, was urged by his wife, Linda, to read the manifesto.
Oh.
Yeah. Linda had harbored suspicions for a while based on Ted's estrangement and location. David was initially highly dismissive, refusing to believe his brother was a killer. But as he read the published text, the phrasing began to haunt him.
And it wasn't just a vague similarity in tone, right? There was a very specific linguistic quirk that sealed his fate.
Yes. Kaczynski had a habit of using the original, somewhat archaic phrasing of a common idiom. Instead of writing, "You can't have your cake and eat it too," he correctly inverted it, writing, "You can't eat your cake and have it too."
Oh, man.
David recognized that exact, rigid phrasing from letters Ted had sent him privately years earlier.
I cannot fathom the psychological agony of that realization. Sitting in your living room, staring at a newspaper, and slowly realizing that your own brother, a man you grew up with and once deeply admired, is literally a phantom serial killer the entire country is hunting.
And unimaginable.
But David made the agonizing, incredibly brave decision to turn his brother in to the FBI.
And that tip led directly to the raid on the Lincoln, Montana cabin in April 1996. The FBI tactical team arrested a disheveled Kaczynski. Inside that tiny space, they found the undeniable mechanics of his terror-raw bomb-making components, a fully constructed live explosive device, the original typed manuscript of the manifesto, and something even more astonishing:
What was that?
over 40,000 pages of handwritten journals.
And he didn't just write a standard diary confessing to his crimes, did he? He applied that massive Harvard and Michigan mathematical intellect to encrypt his thoughts. He built these incredibly complex grid matrices and numerical code systems to mask his descriptions of the bombings.
The cryptography was staggering. It wasn't just a simple letter substitution code. He used complex transpositions, meaning he altered the physical positions of the letters within the text based on mathematical equations he designed.
That is insane.
And he wrote detailed entries expressing his intense frustration when a bomb failed to kill its target, and his cold satisfaction when it succeeded. Cryptanalysts at the FBI later admitted that if they hadn't physically found his personalized translation keys hidden inside the cabin, they likely never would have cracked the code.
Which highlights a massive, glaring irony here. He spent decades hiding completely off the grid, desperate to physically separate himself from society. But his intellectual ego, his absolute need to have his ideology published, read, and validated by the very masses he despised, became the exact mechanism that led to his capture.
And that overriding ego carried right over into his legal proceedings. Once he was indicted, his federal public defenders realized the only viable strategy to save him from execution was an insanity defense. They had a forensic psychiatrist examine him, resulting in a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia.
But Kaczynski furiously rejected this tactic.
Furiously. He absolutely refused to be dismissed as mentally ill. He wanted the world to view him as a hyper-rational actor who had waged a legitimate ideological war against a corrupt system.
So he just fought his own lawyers.
He fought his own legal team relentlessly. He tried to fire his attorneys. And when the judge refused to allow him to represent himself and dropped the mental illness defense, Kaczynski actually attempted suicide in his holding cell. He would rather die than have his ideology legally categorized as the byproduct of a diseased mind.
Wow. But ultimately, backed into a legal corner, Kaczynski chose to plead guilty in 1998 to all charges. By taking the plea deal, he avoided a public trial where his sanity would be debated on national television, and he avoided the death penalty.
Right.
He accepted 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He essentially demanded to be the author of his own narrative to the very bitter end, even if it guaranteed he would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box.
And he did. He was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, the highest security supermax prison in the United States.
Yeah.
He spent his final decades entirely isolated, yet constantly corresponding with thousands of people by mail.
He was still writing.
Oh yeah, continuing to write books, expanding on his philosophy until his health severely declined, leading to his suicide in his cell in 2023.
We really have to acknowledge the extremely disturbing legacy he leaves behind. While it is entirely true that modern society struggles deeply with the alienating effects of technology, Kaczynski's response was a horrific campaign of violence that destroyed innocent lives. The fact that his writings have found a modern audience among various online extremist groups who just, overlook his murders to praise his philosophy is a pretty grim reality of the internet age.
It is a legacy of profound destruction. I mean, he possessed a once-in-a-generation intellect, and instead of using it to solve the societal problems he identified, he weaponized it against individuals who were simply going about their daily lives.
So, as we wrap up this historical reconstruction, I want to leave you with a final, lingering paradox to consider. Theodore Kaczynski dedicated his entire adult life to violently dismantling the technological system because he firmly believed it stripped humans of their natural autonomy. Yet, to wage this war, he didn't rely on primitive natural tools.
No, he didn't.
He relied on highly advanced geometric mathematics, complex mechanical engineering to construct his devices, and incredibly intricate cryptographic algorithms to hide his actions. This represents the absolute pinnacle of cold, technical, systematic thinking.
Which forces us to ask, was his ultimate rebellion genuinely an escape from the machine, or was it just another manifestation of the highly calculated technical world he claimed to hate? It really suggests how nearly impossible it is to truly separate our minds from the systems that shape us.
We started this deep dive talking about a slow-motion derailment, watching a brilliant mind systematically disconnect from humanity. And in the end, it seems the further he ran into the woods to escape the machine, the more he became a machine himself, cold, calculated, and entirely detached from human empathy. Thank you for joining us as we unpack this deeply unsettling history. Keep questioning the complex stories behind the headlines, and we will catch you next time.